Hey everyone, it's Wayne Hsiung here. I'm a co-founder of the Animal Rights Network Direct Action Network. I'm with a civil liberties attorney named Matthew Strugar, and we're talking about the recent news that an Iowa federal court struck down an Ag-Gag law. And for those of you who don't know what the Ag-Gag law is, there are laws that have criminalized the mere act of taking photographs of what happens in factory farms. And this is a concern not just for animal rights advocates like me, but for ordinary citizens who eat food, which I think is probably all of you. But we're really lucky here to have a lawyer who's been working hard on these issues for most of the past 2 years and has litigated these cases across the nation, Matthew Strugar. Matthew, you are an attorney who's worked with the Center for Constitutional Rights, the National Lawyers Guild, and now you're working for animal rights too because you're concerned about what's happening with these ag-gag laws across the country. Can you tell us a little bit about this decision in Iowa and why it matters so much?
Sure. So ag-gag laws, generally for people who don't know, are these state level laws in mostly agricultural states that seek to somehow prevent undercover investigations at factory farms, usually employment-based investigations. So they work by prohibiting taking pictures on a factory farm, or sometimes limiting access, or sometimes requiring mandatory reporting as soon as someone witnesses a crime against an animal, in a way that would shut down the ability to gather footage of systematic abuses. So a number of states have these laws. We've been going after them for a number of years now in a couple of different states. We can go over, sort of what states have them and what states don't. But for the purposes of your question, on January 9th, the federal court in the Southern District of Iowa, which covers Des Moines, found that the Iowa law was a violation of the rights of free speech and free press embodied in the First Amendment, and found that it was unconstitutional.
Yeah, and actually, just to give people some clear context of the sort of behavior that's being criminalized, I'm going to switch over to some video footage that was shot in Utah by one of your clients, Amy Meyer, showing a cow who's being pushed around in a forklift or a bulldozer. This is a cow who's collapsed on the ground, and I'm going to warn you guys, this is not the prettiest
Oh
sight.
my God!
Is the cow
He's alive,
on
I
that
think.
bulldozer?
Yes, he's alive. I think. Oh my God! Oh my God! Oh my God!
And what happened in this case is two women were just driving around in Utah. They see a cow collapse on the ground outside of a large factory farm facility. They pull out their camera on a public road and document the conditions, and suddenly they end up being charged under the Utah Ag-Gag law. And you represented Amy. Can you tell us a little bit about what happened here and when they reached out to you, how they were feeling about it?
Sure. So, most of these ag-gag laws seek to criminalize undercover investigations at employment-based undercover investigations at factory farms. So those investigations often are much more brutal than even what you just showed. They show factory workers kicking pigs in the head, spray painting them in the eyes, throwing chickens and turkeys like footballs, smashing piglets' heads against concrete floors. So those are the sort of the horrors that employment-based investigations uncover. Amy Meyer happened to just be driving down a street in Draper, Utah, at a facility that she knew was a slaughter facility, and just saw from the road, not even as an employee, not even close up, saw from the road this footage and just started to film it. The workers at the factory said, oh no, we have this new ag-gag law. You can't take these kinds of pictures, and sort of threatened her. And she said, no, I know I have the right to do this. I'm on the side of the road. I'm from a public easement. And then, police came and harassed her, and she had charges filed against her just for filming from a public easement. Fun note about Amy's case is that the owner of the slaughterhouse was the mayor's brother. Yeah. So something you find in a lot of these cases with big ag is that they're very politically connected.
Yeah, and we'll show the footage just real quick of Amy being confronted by the owner of the farm, who I think is...
Pardon anymore.
If you read the rights here in the laws in Utah, you can't film an agricultural property without my consent.
That's correct.
Nice
on
day.
Your property.
So the footage I just showed is the owner driving by and saying, you cannot film an agricultural corporation, an agricultural facility in the state of Utah. And the result is people across the nation were terrified this is going to happen to them. They could face very serious charges. And obviously, I know this very well as someone who's currently facing 15 felonies for investigating animal abuse. But the result of these decisions has been international media attention, and there's been an incredible backlash. And I'll show you all just kind of the headline that came out in Forbes, at one of the major business publications in the United States, saying the judge overturns Iowa's Ag-Gag law in a victory for good business. And the first line of this article is amazing. Suppose your business was caught doing something very, very bad, something that was ethically appalling, like abusing defenseless living creatures and risking the safety of an entire supply chain. Would you, A, apologize profusely, or B, mount a multi-million-dollar campaign to pass as many state laws as possible to ensure that no one would ever find out that you're abusing animals and contaminating the food supply? And that is kind of what the industry has done over the past couple of years. But they're losing. Could you tell us a little bit about how these cases have gone? And you've litigated how many of these cases now? Is it 3?
It depends on how you count. So there are either, depending on how you count, 9 or 10 ag-gag laws that have been enacted over the years. Yeah. Those are Idaho, Utah, Iowa, Kansas, Montana, North Dakota, Missouri, North Carolina, Arkansas, and there's some debate about whether this Wyoming law that exists is an ag-gag law or not. I've been part of challenges to 6 of those now. We have filed and successfully struck down Idaho's, Utah's, and Iowa's, and we currently have litigation pending against Kansas and North Carolina.
Great. Have you lost any of these cases yet?
So in North Carolina, we lost at the district court level. They said that the plaintiffs didn't have standing, and we can get into sort of why, but that's a little bit wonky lawyer stuff. We went up to the Circuit Court of Appeals, the appellate court. The appellate court said, nope, the plaintiffs have standing, and it got sent back down to the district court. So we lost, then we got it back, and now we're fighting again.
Great. And actually, North Carolina, that's a good segue, because North Carolina is one of the states where, in fact, DxE activists are facing charges. 2 young women who had no criminal history, one person's a school teacher, one person is a student, found out that gestation crates were being used in North Carolina, contrary to what the company had committed to the public. They said they weren't using these crates. And I'll just show you the video footage of a mother pig who's trapped in a crate that her body is too big to even fit in this crate. And she's been living in this crate her entire life, oftentimes for years on end. And this is despite the fact the company had committed to the public to stop using these crates. A 2-foot by 6.5-foot crate that a mother pig lives her entire life. These activists took some photos and video inside the facility, and now they're facing multiple felony charges in North Carolina. So why is it, do you think, that the industry has resorted to using these statutes? And how is it that they've been able to pass so many statutes despite the fact that they're unconstitutional? Because frankly, they're kicking up a hornet's nest where not just animal rights activists, but even civil liberties advocates like you are now fighting the industry. How do you explain that?
So there's 2 parts to your question. The first is, why push these ag-gag laws? And I think that is indisputable. The sunlight that has come through undercover animal investigations, especially in the last few years, but I mean, we talk about in these ag-gag cases, the history of undercover, even employment-based investigations into the food supply goes back to over 100 years, to Upton Sinclair, into the jungle, into the Chicago meatpacking industry. But especially since undercover video has become so easy to obtain and easy to conceal the equipment, the outcomes of employment-based investigations, or any kind of animal factory farm investigations, have been criminal prosecutions, civil lawsuits, legislative reform, factory closures, meat recalls. The largest meat recall in U.S. history was the product of a HSUS investigation here in California. Corporate shaming, decreased consumer confidence, and maybe most important, all decreased meat consumption. There's been studies that the industry themselves have commissioned that said, increased media attention to animal welfare issues trigger consumers to purchase less meat rather than reallocate expenditures across competing meats. So the why is because undercover investigations are effective at exposing the cruelty inherent in factory farming. The how is simply that they have a lot of money, that they're very well politically connected, and we've seen in a lot of these agricultural states that oftentimes they're not just politically connected. The industry are the politicians. There are huge factory farmers or even small farmers who are the people in the legislature who are enacting these laws.
Yeah, so a great example, this is North Carolina. I'm going to show you all some footage from North Carolina from a factory farm that was investigated called Purdue. And Purdue is one of the largest agribusiness concerns in the world. They like to market their products as humane and free range. And this is from a free range chicken farm that's owned by Purdue. and you see animals collapse on the ground, including these baby birds who grow so fast and are so sick they can't even stand. Animals that are still alive and sick on the ground being trampled to death, and then obviously extreme crowding. You have thousands and thousands of animals crammed in industrial sites. And this is at a farm that's being marketed as free range and humane. And so what happens is, after these investigations come out showing this horrendous cruelty, senators and legislators like Brent Jackson in North Carolina state senator who is behind the Ag-Gag law and a separate law that is actually preventing lawsuits against factory farms, pass laws, get hundreds of thousands of dollars in donations from companies like Smithfield and Purdue, and then they pass laws to protect the industry. And so it's a direct result of the investigations. It's kind of funny how they're not even particularly apologetic about the fact that they're just turning around and seeing this investigation is damaging the industry and acting on behalf of the industry, which isn't the way a democracy is supposed to work. But
yeah, absolutely, and that's why we have to, unfortunately, resort to the courts and to the First Amendment, to the right to sort of bring sunlight and to be able to report on the things you actually see when you're on a job.
Yeah. And thank God we do have the First Amendment. We have at least some basic legal principles that control our legal system, our political system. But we also know that even these court cases, we like to think, and a lot of laymen like to think, that our legal system is very black and white. It's just about the rules. But the reality is judges are very political animals. And a lot depends on which specific judge you get and how the politics of a case unfold. So I'm wondering, when you're litigating one of these ag-gag cases and you're worried that these folks are going to prison for simply taking photographs, how do you try to persuade a judge that it's not the right outcome from a legal perspective, understanding that this is also just ultimately a political issue?
Yeah, that's a great point, and I completely agree. And something we try to do in these cases is try to be very cognizant of that and try to build coalitions outside of just animal rights groups. So there are animal rights groups on most of these cases. Animal Legal Defense Fund is really leading the charge on all of these cases. But, in addition, and there's PETA and there's some other groups, but in addition, we try to get the ACLU of whatever state that we are suing and the state affiliate to be a part of this, to sort of bring the civil rights gravitas to the case and to the judge. When we brought the Idaho case up on appeal, we tried to build a large coalition of what's called amicus curiae, which means friend of the court, people who weigh in to sort of say, yes, we agree that this is a civil rights, civil liberties issue that goes outside of animal rights. And in the Ninth Circuit, we got the United Farm Workers, which was great to weigh in on our side. A state AFL-CIO talked about the threat to workers who couldn't take pictures of unsafe conditions at their job sites. Food and Water Watch, environmental groups. Center for Constitutional Rights, where I used to work and is a leading civil rights organization. A bunch of publishing companies, media organizations, and even Erwin Chemerinsky, who's dean of Berkeley Law School.
Yeah, one of the most prominent constitutional law scholars in the world.
Yes.
Yeah.
So part of the fight to sort of not make it look like it's just a bunch of kooky animal rights people is to sort of build these coalitions. But frankly, it should take that. It should just be enough that there's a violation of free speech and free press, and no matter who it is. But like you said, it's not a robotic system. It's a political system in some sense. So you have to play the politics.
Yeah, and I think you and I would probably both agree that the politics really does make a big difference. If you see so many different civil rights organizations coming in defense of animals and animal advocates, then suddenly it doesn't seem like a marginal fringe issue. It's an issue that all Americans need to care about. And I want to welcome all the folks from Now This who just joined us. We just had a few hundred people join us instantly because Now This started sharing this live stream. But what we're talking about is the Ag-Gag laws that have criminalized exposing gestation crates like this. And this is a gestation crate that was actually shot in a state that has an active ag law, North Carolina. And you can see 400 pigs. They're trapped in these 2-foot by 6.5 feet crates. 14 square feet of space for their entire life. And some of these crates are too small to even fit the animals inside. And we also showed footage earlier of just normal citizens, private citizens who are driving by a factory farm in Utah. They saw,
Oh my God! It's a cow.
They saw a mother cow who had collapsed on the ground, who was suffering on the ground, was being pushed around in a forklift. And when they called the police and activated and asked the authorities to take some sort of action, instead of arresting the farmers or investigating the animal cruelty on site, these activists were facing charges. And this has been happening across the state, across the nation, frankly. And we have, thankfully, a lawyer who's been litigating these cases, Matthew Strugar, with us. But I'm wondering, Matthew, to us as ordinary citizens watching, this seems like a straightforward case of corruption. There's an animal being abused. A normal, decent, upstanding citizen documents what's happening, sends it to the authorities, and they end up getting charged. What does the industry say about these laws? How do they justify and explain these to the public? Can you tell us a little about what legal arguments and what political and ethical arguments they're making to justify sending people to jail for taking photographs?
Sure. So some of the, I would say, more honest legislators who talk about introduce these bills and advocate for these bills just sort of talk about how undercover investigations are really effective at harming their industry and that they need to be protected. So some of them are just blatant about it and they don't try to hide it, which, I kind of appreciate. The more sort of, in some of the lawsuits and even in some of the legislatures, some of the justifications talk about biosecurity risks. They say that by undercover investigators coming onto a factory farm, they could create some kind of vector for viruses and infections because they are there to do something other than abuse and slaughter animals or do whatever their job is supposed to be.
Can I interject on that one just real quick, Matthew? Because anyone who's actually been inside of a factory farm knows that the risk of disease is coming from inside that facility, not from the outside. These places are filled with filth and feces and antibiotics and drugs and chemicals, and yet they're saying activists are threatening the animals in the food supply by coming in and exposing what they're already doing. I mean, I just want to point out the irony, absurdity of that statement by the industry.
And so we have, in the Utah case, in our challenge to the Utah Ag-Gag statute, we actually developed all of this through expert discovery, which was pretty interesting. And in the end, well, first I'll talk about our expert report. We had Sean Thomas, who was the investigator at the Hallmark meat facility, who used to work for HSUS, which led to the largest meat recall in U.S. history. And he talked about basically what little training, what little biosecurity protocols there are at factory farms generally, and how investigators follow all of the same protocols that any other worker follows. The state came in and said, oh, these animal rights organizations don't even train their employees on biosecurity risks. Well, of course not. They're supposed to get that training at the job. And if the animal rights organizations were giving some kind of other training, they would object to that. Hey, they're giving some different training that might not be as good as ours. So in the end, the judge looked at the biosecurity arguments and said, this seems pretextual, this seems bogus, but even if I accept that it really was the reason, the prohibition on taking a photograph has nothing to do with biosecurity. Like, it's both under-inclusive and over-inclusive because it just doesn't get at the problem. If you're looking to get at a biosecurity risk, you should have a law that prohibits access or requires some kind of protocol. But saying you can't take a picture does nothing to protect biosecurity. So we've been able to defeat those kinds of arguments as well.
Yeah, and I think that just goes to the bigger picture, which is that this is an industry that relies on misinformation and deceit. It's the only way they can sell their products to the public. And one example of this is the biggest pork company in the world, Smithfield. And I just want to show folks, this is a Washington Post article from 2007. When undercover investigations came out showing these horrible gestation crates, these crates where mother pigs are trapped in essentially metal coffins. They live in a metal coffin their entire life. Smithfield Foods said, oh my gosh, we're so concerned about this because all of our consumers and citizens are saying this is a horrible thing. So we're going to announce in January 2007 that in 10 years, we are going to phase out gestation crates. And just this past year, in fact, 2018, they said we've done it. And that achieving this goal, and I'm showing people the exact quote, achieving this goal is a testament to the fact that at Smithfield, we keep our promises. We stand committed to leading the industry in both animal care and transparency. And then, I just want to show folks real quick what actually happened. So just a few months after they said, at Smithfield, we keep our promises, DxE activists in North Carolina went into a Smithfield facility and found, lo and behold, pigs in gestation crates, thousands and thousands of mother pigs in gestation crates. And yet Smithfield, instead of acknowledging there was some problem, acknowledging their promise had not been upheld, they've used laws like the Ag-Gag laws to go after activists for merely taking these photographs. And the woman in this photo right here, whose name is Arwen Carlin, is now facing 2 felony charges in North Carolina, merely for going into a facility, taking photographs. And when she was arrested in North Carolina, it's not too often that the police work hand in hand with corporations to do a criminal prosecution. But guess who showed up at her door along with the sheriff of the county that she was in? Smithfield executives and management were there with her, with the police, and arresting her and taking her off to jail. what does that say about our political system when our corporations are basically controlling our law enforcement, and law enforcement is acting as a division of corporate security for a large corporation like Smithfield?
Yeah, breaking news. The government works for the rich. But and I don't mean to belittle the point. It's a very serious point, and it's a real problem with the entire system, both in huge corporations and the animal rights world, and housing and everything else, as we know in California. So the rich are able to put the people in power, and then the people in power do the rich's bidding.
And does this come up in court at all? I mean, are you allowed to make these arguments that this is pretty much a straightforward quid pro quo when someone is getting hundreds and thousands of dollars in donations from a company, and then they're litigating this case or passing laws in defense of the company? I mean,
not really. We've tried to get at some of that. The American Legislative Exchange Council, which some of the viewers might be aware of, it's a giant corporate sort of membership organization that has a lot of the biggest corporations in the world, and ALEC proposes a lot of legislation. So they are there to sort of draft legislation and give it to legislators and then sort of push them to do that. So ALEC had a model Ag-Gag bill that is what a lot of these states have modeled their laws on. And in a couple of these cases, we've had allegations of the complaint that, hey, we think this is all coming from the American Legislative Exchange Council. Yep. We've had the states deny that. We had one guy in Idaho, I think, submit a declaration or make a statement. I forget what it was, but he said, I drafted this around my farm table and around my dinner table in my farm, and very down home. There's no big corporation telling me what to do. This is what I did. It's just the words just happen to be almost identical to the model statute. So we haven't been able to sort of get discovery on that, and I don't know that it would matter for the judge's perspective. It matters sort of as a democratic idea, but we don't need discovery in the lawsuits to sort of talk about what it means for democracy. But for the sort of the constitutional question, it sort of doesn't matter who's calling the shots. It just matters that the state is enacting these laws.
Yeah, and I guess the other point to make about this is even in cases where the Ag-Gag laws have been struck down, and this actually happened to us in Utah, where we did an investigation of the largest pig farm in the nation. It's called Circle 4 Farms. We found footage like this, and again, I'm going to show you this footage. It's a little disturbing, of literally dozens and dozens of baby pigs being thrown into garbage cans. A mother pig who is thrown headfirst into a dumpster at the largest pig farm in the nation, Circle 4 Farms in Utah. A couple weeks later, a federal judge struck down the Ag-Gag law, said this is unconstitutional. You can't stop people from taking photographs like this. But we were still charged. And we were charged with, among other things, conspiracy, racketeering, and rioting, which is the most interesting charge. And Glenn Greenwald, among others, I'm just going to show you guys the article that Glenn wrote about this, did an amazing expose of this and pointed out that, first of all, the prosecutors in this case have been getting a ton of money directly from the company that we investigated. But secondly, this is basically end run around the Ag-Gag laws, because after all, if you can still put people in prison for racketeering and rioting for investigating factory farms, then have we actually effectively protected free speech? Do you have any thoughts on that, Matthew? And these criminal cases we're seeing across the nation against activists, even in states where the Ag-Gag laws have been struck down?
Yeah, I think there are slightly different issues. I think it's still reprehensible that the police are at the beck and call of huge, powerful corporations and are sort of doing their bidding. But as a strict constitutional matter, one of our main argument in the Ag-Gag cases is that you can't just go, or one of the main arguments. So, we say they're unconstitutional for a number of reasons, but one of the arguments is that it just targets one viewpoint. It just targets animal rights activists. And, one of our arguments is, if you want to do this constitutionally, you need a law that applies to everybody. Now, that's not really a great result in the end when, they can use sort of a racketeering law or whatever, these other laws that activists have been charged with. But it brings up slightly different questions constitutionally, if not sort of morally and ethically.
Yeah, and for those of you who don't know, racketeering conspiracy statutes were passed, largely to combat organized crime, and that's what they're usually directed towards. They go after gangs and drug gangs, folks who are murdering people. And in this case, they're going after people who took a few photographs and took a sick pig to the vet. So I want to show you just to make clear how much these cases are about free speech, this is actually a probation order. So in one of the cases that I'm being prosecuted under, this Investigative Smithfield, they targeted 5 activists. 3 of the activists have now gotten out of the case by accepting a plea bargain deal. And the primary term they offered these defendants in exchange for not putting them in jail, and I'm going to read it to you, is no trespass on victim Smithfield's property in Utah. And here's the important thing. No social media, website, or other criticism or derision of Smithfield, personnel or otherwise. So again, this is right after the Utah government was told you're not allowed to prosecute people for free speech, for taking photographs, for criticizing corporate abuses. The government does exactly the same thing and gets exactly the same outcome, no social media or criticism of Smithfield, by charging people with racketeering. So I
think you just went mute.
I went mute. Did I go mute, Matt? I just went mute. How do I unmute myself? Okay.
There you go. Sorry.
Okay. So, I mean, I don't know what to do with this at this point. If we win in federal court and the court says free speech is allowed, and then right after that, the Utah government is allowed to prosecute activists with these heavy-handed prosecutions, starting them with 60 years for exposing cruelty like this, then, I mean, what is the solution for us? What are our next steps, Matthew?
Well, I think like what you're doing is you have to actually fight the case. Unfortunately, I don't know so much about what constitutional conditions can be, the constitutional limitations on conditions in a plea bargain, but I think you can plea away your own constitutional rights. I don't think a court could sentence you to that if you were convicted. So, but that puts you in you personally and, collectively, someone who's facing this generally, in a very difficult position of literally staring down, over a decade of time for because you want to be able to still exercise your First Amendment rights, and you have to roll the dice and go to trial and think what some peers who aren't your peers because they're in rural Utah, think of what you did. So that's just I think that gets at the broader criminal justice issue of the power that prosecutors have to overcharge, really scare people, and then force a plea, which is unfortunately how 98% of the criminal justice system works, is that somebody has a charge that should be something that should have 6 months, and then they're facing down an inflated charge of 5 or 10 years just to put pressure on them to plead to the 6 months.
Yeah, and I think your point about how we have to try and convince folks in places like North Carolina and Utah who might not be progressives who watch now this or the Young Turks is a good one. But here's what convinces me that we can win, even in Utah and North Carolina. And this is from a Vox article. After we did our investigation in North Carolina and Ag-Gag state, here's some of the things that were found in the photographs and videos. Numerous cases of gaping wounds and infections on pigs. Pigs whose skin appeared infected. Pigs with infected cysts. Sows whose nipples have been injured sufficiently that their piglets are nursing on pus and blood. Plastic bags full of clipped off testicles. And here's a big one. The use of Carbadox, an antibiotic which is a known carcinogen, in which the Food and Drug Administration has moved to ban. And when Vox actually interviewed the Smithfield veterinarian and the Smithfield employees who were responsible for this particular farm in North Carolina, they conceded that the company still uses Carbadox and will continue to use it. And this is a drug that is carcinogenic at all levels, that literally could kill our kids. So, I think our hope is that if we can show the public the truth about what's happening, that even folks who you wouldn't expect to be allies to the animal rights movement will ultimately jump forward and say, this isn't just a civil liberties issue. This is an animal cruelty issue. This is a food safety issue that we all have to get behind. And as someone who's worked at civil liberties organizations like the Center for Constitutional Rights, I think you've probably seen this evolution too, where mainstream progressive organizations and advocates for civil liberties, for human rights, are now realizing that the animal rights movement and the human rights issues are all intertwined. We have to work together on this.
Hey, Matthew, real quick, if you happen to have any earbuds you can grab real fast, it'll help on the audio. I don't know if you could have anything available for this, so.
Give me 1 second. Well, I gotta connect them. Is that better?
It's much better. So again, we were talking about how, as we increasingly realize that the abuses in factory farms aren't just an animal rights issue; they're a human rights issue because, among other things, carcinogens are being sold to our kids. Pollution is being spread in communities of color that surround these factory farms because the only folks who live near factory farms are folks who are so disadvantaged and have so little political power that when a factory farm is constructed next to their school or their neighborhood, there's nothing they can do about it because the political powers that be don't care about their concerns either. So there's deep intersections between the animal rights issues and the human rights issues that are unfolding in states like North Carolina and Utah. But the big question is, how do we continue to build these coalitions, and how do we get organizations like the Center for Constitutional Rights, the National Lawyers Guild, concerned not just about the civil liberties issues with factory farming, but frankly, the animal rights and the human rights issues, the substantive ethical and political issues of whether factory farms should exist at all in this nation?
So I think that's exactly how you build political movements, and I think that's what you're talking about. I'll tell you, when I was at the Center for Constitutional Rights in 2005 or 2006, and some animal rights activists who were facing federal prosecution for their activism came to CCR and asked for help. There was some pushback. There was some, these are just white kids who only care about puppies kind of statements, and I think people started to realize, no, this is how they come after movements, even if this isn't a movement that I'm a part of. This can be a threat to everyone. And I think it's good that the animal rights movement is starting to see, or not maybe starting, but maybe centering more the intersection with workers' rights, with economic justice, with environmental racism, and the horrors that these workers face in the factory farms, who are mostly black and brown and almost overwhelmingly poor. That's how you build a movement. I'm 40 years old. I think when I was an environmental activist in the early 90s, there was a lot of the same kind of stuff of, this is white rich kids who care about this kind of stuff. Mm-hmm. And now you see, every young progressive talking about a Green New Deal and how we have 12 years left to save the planet. Yeah. And you do that by listening to other people, by bringing in other movements, by making those connections, and also recognizing that taking on some of the criticism that, okay, maybe this is in a lot of ways a white privilege movement, and trying to do your best to make sure that that's not the way it is going forward. But that's just how political movements are built.
Yeah, and if you look at kind of the faces of the animal rights movement, especially in the grassroots, on our steering committee, it's 60% people of color. We have Sikh immigrants from Guatemala. Myself, I'm Chinese and grew up in an immigrant family in central Indiana with, my parents came to this country with $40 in my pocket. And so I think part of that is just kind of making sure that people see what the animal rights movement actually is, which is people like me. The people who are most affected by factory farms in today's world are the Chinese. Poor Chinese workers, because Smithfield, a lot of people don't know this company that is being defended by a lot of privileged white politicians in North Carolina is owned by the Chinese government. It is massively constructing factory farms, these multi-level factory farms, where there are pigs being raised in skyscraper-like buildings that go up 10, 20 stories tall in China. And the workers and the surrounding populations in these poor communities in Asia are the ones most afflicted by the pollution, by the disease, by the antibiotics being spread from this factory farm. But another argument that's been used against the animal rights movement is the fact that we're all criminals and terrorists and extremists, right? And this applied to the environmental movement as well. When activists started taking nonviolent direct action, as we've been taking, there's something about the criminalization of dissent that scares off a lot of mainstream organizations. And I know you have some stories from both CCR and from defending animal rights activists of how hard it is sometimes to get mainstream progressive organizations, even within your movement, to defend grassroots activists who are risking everything to fight for a better world. And so maybe you could share a little about that and how we can get, the big greens, the big nonprofits, on board supporting grassroots activists who are risking serious jail time to expose corporate abuse.
Yeah, I think the terrorism and the extremist labels are pretty effectively used by organizations who don't want to debate animal rights people on the merits. Yeah. So they come after their tactics. Just take something like, it's outside the animal rights context, but take something like kneeling during the, Colin Kaepernick and Eric Reed kneeling during the national anthem to protest against police brutality. It's a silent protest. They're not doing much of it. You know, when people take the streets, they're like, oh, you should have a more respectful silent protest. And people have a silent protest and they're like, oh, you know, you're disrespecting the troops. They always go after the tactics because they don't want to talk about, they don't want to, they can't talk about the issue. They're going to lose on the issue. So, but that gets used pretty effectively and can scare some of the more mainstream organizations who are a little bit more, you know, I don't want to say gun shy, but a little bit more risk adverse in a lot of ways, and are afraid to rock the boat. I mean, when we filed our first Ag-Gag case, we had, you know, the largest animal rights organization in the country, Humane Society, come in and tell us that it was a mistake to file, and that we were going to lose, and that this was a big mistake, and that we were all they didn't say dumb. They did say it was a mistake and that we were going to lose. But you know, they you know, their lawyers were telling us that this was, you know, going to be such a harm to the animal rights movement. And right now we are, you know, 3 for 3 with 2 pending. So, you know, and then so part of also getting, you know, getting these other organizations on board is just showing that we're right, winning these cases like that, and then also showing the effectiveness that the sort of grassroots activists who you're more talking about, showing the effectiveness and sort of how that kind of action can both inspire people and further build movements.
Yeah, it's hard not to kind of analogize this to what happened in the 2016 primary, the Democratic primary between Bernie and Clinton. Because, you know, there too, there is this debate between the grassroots and the mainstream candidate, and there was a lot of recognition afterwards that there had to be much more integration. And frankly, I'm not of them. I'm a grassroots activist. You know, I was a Bernie type person in the progressive campaign in 2016, but I think there has to be some integration. These two sides of progressive movements need to work together to be effective. And I think the way we can be most effective is just being true to our vision. Because at the end of the day, if we really believe, if we want to say what we believe, if we think our vision is a good one, whether it's, you know, Medicare for all, free college tuition, or a world where animals are not being brutalized in factory farms, people would be drawn to that. And absolutely, the mainstream organizations are right that we do need to make some small steps to get to that ultimate vision. But if we're confident in our vision, and if we're confident in our message that, and I'm showing another footage from a Purdue farm, if we're confident that when people see animals collapse on the ground, flapping their wings, in agony, animals with broken bones and sores all over their bodies, their faces, their legs, animals being cannibalized and mutilated by the billions, that the public will stand up against it. Let's just stand behind that vision. Let's not be afraid to expose these industries, even in the Ag-Gag states. And if we do that, and if we work together in defending our right to expose these abuses and take care of the animals who are being abused, then we'll win this fight. And that's what I think you all have proven. That you can fight for grassroots activists like Amy Meyer in Utah. You can fight for grassroots activists like the activists in DxE being prosecuted with all these ridiculous felony charges in North Carolina, Colorado, Utah, and California. And we can win. Win not just in court, but in public opinion too. And again, I'm just showing people just some headlines from recent Ag-Gag decisions. We see over and over again, when the media actually writes about these stories in a real and substantive way, they're on our side. Because after all, who can be on the side of a corporation that is abusing animals, polluting the air and the water, and endangering our families? So I guess the next question for me is, how do we wrench back control in our political system, not just in these discrete cases, but in the broader picture? Because while it's great that we win these individual cases one by one and that they can no longer stop us from exposing their cruelty, at the end of the day, the abuse is still happening, the antibiotics are still being given to the animals, and kids are still getting sick across the nation because of factory farms. I mean, what do you think we do? You as a lawyer who's seen these cases, seen how these corporations operate, seeing their discovery, you can see their internal communications and see how they work to suppress accurate information from getting out. What do you think we do to wrest political control back from these big factory farms that are owned by the most powerful governments in the world in some cases, like Smithfield?
So let me answer in 2 capacities. First is as a lawyer who represents movements, including the animal rights movement. As I was brought up at Center for Constitutional Rights and in the National Lawyers Guild to tell that movement lawyers are there to support the movement, and the movement dictates the political agenda. So I'm not here to tell protesters what's a good way to protest and what's a bad way to protest. I'm here to say, no matter what you do, we're going to have your back, and we're going to fight for your right to be able to push your political agenda. So that's my answer as a lawyer. As I'm also part of these movements. So, you know, as an activist, and this isn't coming from any sort of any like legal background or my role as a lawyer, just as somebody who's been a part of these for a number of years, I just think you just have to build capacity. This is all about capacity. Every march, every petition, everything is just to try to show power that we have the numbers behind us. They're called demonstrations because they're a demonstration of political power. They're a demonstration of capacity. So we still need to, make those connections with other movements, continue to expose things, continue to educate people. Yeah. It's a slow process, but that's really the only way. That's really the only way to do it, short of, seizing the means of production, which I fully support as well. But I don't think that also takes its different capacity building.
Yeah, and I think part of that is just education, information, and recognizing that even folks we think are our adversaries, when we actually tell the story of what's happening in the food system, they're going to come on our side. And Smithfield is such a great example of this, because Smithfield is not advocating for farmers or ordinary people in North Carolina. They're not advocating for Trump supporters even. This is a company that is owned by the Chinese government, that is funding political campaigns in North Carolina. And it's so funny right now. I mean, everybody is up in arms about the Huawei scandal, where this Chinese cell phone company is trying to build infrastructure in Europe and North America, and there's a concern about spying that's happening. Even obviously, we should be concerned about that. We should be concerned about the Chinese government spying on our conversations. We should also be concerned about the Chinese government feeding our kids contaminated and adulterated food products. And that's exactly what's happening. Where Smithfield was bought out by the Chinese government and the largest acquisition of a U.S. company, it was rubber stamped by the U.S. Congress. And now Smithfield, a company that has conceded that they're feeding our kids carcinogens, like carbodox, that has been exposed as lying to the public about where their meat is coming from. This company is controlling our food system. 1/3 of the pork in the United States comes from Smithfield. And even farmers in North Carolina, ordinary consumers, Trump supporters, Trump voters in North Carolina should be concerned about this. And I think when we tell this story, we are going to see a movement rise up and try and wrest control back from these big factory farms into the hands of the people. And we're seeing this grow every single day. So now this audience is asking who we are. So I'm just going to refresh folks again and explain what happened over the past couple weeks. But my name is Wayne. I'm a lawyer and former law professor at Northwestern. I did First Amendment work 10 years ago as a professor. I'm an animal rights advocate and an investigator of factory farms. My friend Matthew Strugar is also on the line. He's a litigator. He's worked for the Center for Constitutional Rights. He's worked for the National Lawyers Guild, and he's been one of the primary litigators striking down Ag-Gag laws across the entire nation. And what we're talking about today is these laws that have been passed across the country that make it a crime to merely take a photograph of animal abuse, of environmental pollution, of violations of state health codes at a factory farm. For merely taking a photograph and exposing this abuse, people are being charged and going to prison. And I'm going to go back to just one clip. This is just the clip of Amy Meyer in Utah that led to the first Ag-Gag prosecution in Utah. I'm going to show you guys this clip because it's such a disturbing clip. And it's disturbing.
First Ag-Gag prosecution in the country.
First Ag-Gag prosecution in the country, in fact. And I'll just show you all again what this clip shows.
The cow.
He's alive.
On that bulldozer.
Yes, he's alive. I think.
Oh my god. Oh my god. Oh my god. Let's go.
And what this clip shows is there are two women driving by a slaughterhouse in Utah. They saw a cow collapse on the ground, getting picked up by a forklift. And then they saw this cow writhing in agony and moving around. And she was being thrown basically into a garbage area, a dead pile area, which happens to billions of animals every year in factory farms. Literally billions. There are 10 billion farm animals killed in the United States. And even by the industry's own statistics, for example, in chicken farms, the mortality rate is sometimes 10, 20%. So we're talking about 1 to 2 billion animals don't even get to the slaughterhouse. They collapse on the ground from disease, from filth, from being cannibalized or trampled or beaten to death by workers. And then they're thrown into a landfill, sometimes while they're still alive. And for merely exposing these conditions, activists are going to jail. But Matthew, I'm wondering, what do you think the next big legal fight is in these Ag-Gag cases? You said a little bit about Missouri to me earlier. Do you want to talk about what the next case is? We've won in Idaho. We've won in Utah. We've won in Iowa now. North Carolina and Missouri and some other states are coming up. Can you tell us a little about that and what the issues are?
Sure. A few months ago, we filed a lawsuit against Kansas's Ag-Gag statute. Kansas is the first Ag-Gag statute ever passed. It's been on the books since 1990. So a lot of these more recent ones all just came in the last maybe and sort of a spate 5-6 years ago, a new push. But there were also this crop of them that existed from the early 90s, including Kansas's. So we're going after Kansas's, which is much like Iowa and Utah's and Iowa's in the sense that it prohibits obtaining a job at a factory farm to conduct an undercover investigation, and then it prohibits taking an audio-visual capture, whether that be a picture, audio recording, or video recording of inside of the factory farm. North Carolina is a little bit different in that it just prevents undercover investigations. It doesn't even prevent them. It's not a criminal law. Provides a state tort. So basically, instead of the government prosecuting you for violating the Ag-Gag law, Smithfield could sue you for conducting an undercover investigation. So that case is a little different because it applies outside of just the animal rights context. It applies to nursing homes or auto mechanics or daycares or whatever else, grocery stores, anywhere that an undercover investigation might happen. So North Carolina, a little bit different, but that case is already pending and we're fighting that. And then there's an Arkansas law that's much like the North Carolina law that, should North Carolina go well, we'll likely file in Arkansas. I don't think it's any secret that we're just sort of going state by state, picking these off. We don't have the capacity to just file them every challenge to every state law all at once. And it's a little bit better to sort of develop the cases law as we go. Yeah. But then you asked about Missouri. Missouri's got a pretty different statute. Missouri requires mandatory reporting of animal cruelty within 24 hours to a law enforcement authority. So what that basically means is that if an undercover investigator gets a job at a factory farm and on his or her first day, he or she sees somebody abusing an animal in violation of the state cruelty law, the undercover investigator would, I think the intent of the law is the undercover investigator would have to out themselves, would have to come forward to law enforcement and say, I'm doing this undercover investigation. And they can pass those laws because they sound good for animals. It sounds like, somebody abusing an animal, they're just requiring somebody to report it. But that's not what it is. It's there to prevent somebody from going in. And these undercover investigators they go for weeks, they go for months. They take footage of, managers not disciplining people, of systematic abuses that are rubber stamped by management, that are even encouraged, that are sometimes even necessary just for the performance of the job with the pressures. So Missouri requires mandatory reporting within 24 hours. The law is a little sloppy, to be honest. It requires the video be turned over to law enforcement within 24 hours. It doesn't describe what law enforcement is. If somebody wanted to take a video and put it in a FedEx to the Federal Communications Division, that's a law enforcement organization. It's not, they're not a law enforcement organization that would care about anything like this. But because the law doesn't define law enforcement investigation, there might be clever ways around the Missouri Ag-Gag law, but it's still there to be designed to prevent undercover investigations. And it's another state where, we're looking at it.
Yeah, and I just want to point out, as an investigative animal cruelty myself, and I'm showing people more footage of the things you see, this pig has been cut up almost like some sort of, victim of domestic violence, and she has cuts all over her face, and this is inside of a Smithfield facility in North Carolina. The reason this reporting law is so absurd, they say it's about animal welfare and stopping animal cruelty, but every time you do an investigation of a big agribusiness concern like Smithfield, they always say it was an isolated case. It was an isolated case of a worker abusing an animal, or there was just one animal who's sick. There was a hospital barn. This animal is being treated, and so she's injured for sure, but she was one out of the 100 million animals in our supply chain, and they're all fine. Don't worry about it. Things are good. And if you have to report the cruelty immediately after you take the footage, you can't prove that it's a systematic issue. The problem isn't just one-off bad worker or one animal who fell and injured herself, but rather there is a pattern of abuse and misconduct that is appropriate for policymakers to get involved in, that our laws need to be changed, that our corporations need to be transformed in fundamental and dramatic ways. And so what's most egregious about this Missouri law is they say it's about protecting animals, when really they're actually trying to shield the animal abusers from scrutiny and accountability. And that's not the way a democracy should work. It's one thing. I liked what you said earlier about how you like it when the legislators just say outright, yeah, this is about protecting the farms. Because at least they're being honest with us. At least they're being honest with us. Well, in Missouri, they're passing this law that is is dressed up in the nice clothing of animal welfare and humane treatment of animals, when in fact people actually know what happens in an investigation, know this is going to be one of the most effective shields for the industry. This is going to protect the industry from any sort of accountability, because when we show footage like this of a pig who's got cuts all over her face, who's been beaten and shocked and crammed into a crate her entire life, just absolutely disturbing footage of egregious abuse, the company can turn around and say there was just one worker and one animal being abused. Okay, so
I think we could show pretext in most of these cases. If you walk down the street and you see someone murder another person, there's not a mandatory reporting requirement. There are some mandatory reporting requirements for teachers who suspect child abuse and some other situations. But really, like the idea that we have to have mandatory reporting to protect animals because Missouri cares so much about farm animals is, almost so transparent that it's laughable.
Yeah. I'm showing just some other clips of the footage that has come out from inside these horrible factory farms. This is a clip right now that I'm showing of a mother pig's mammary gland that's being nursed on. And one of the things undercover investigators have found in these horrible gestation and farrowing crate facilities is these mother pigs, because they're forcibly impregnated over and over again, they give birth over and over again so rapidly and have to have so many babies, their bodies never have a chance to recover in these crates. And their mammary glands end up literally getting shredded so that they look like these bloody octopuses. And this is footage that we shared with Smithfield, and even their veterinarian said, we can't defend this. We can't defend baby piglets nursing on shredded, bloody, pus-filled nipples. And for the consumers to ultimately eat this flesh, to eat the product of this cruelty, this infection, and this disease. And one of the really disturbing things, photographs that we pulled out from a Smithfield factory farm, is on the card next to each of these mother pigs, who's encased in a metal tomb called a farrowing crate or a gestation crate. It actually says how many intact mammary glands are left. So it's part of their business model that they're going to keep abusing these poor mother pigs, keep forcibly impregnating them, forcing them to have so many babies, nursing so often, never giving them a break, to the point their mammary glands are ripped to shreds and bloody. And it'll list on the card how many intact mammary glands does this pig have left. And when it gets too low, when it goes from like 12 to 11 to 10 to 9, they can't feed their babies, so the mother pigs are shot in the head or thrown into a dumpster. Right? That's kind of what happens to them. So these animals are being treated like machines. So from my perspective, and I'm wondering if you have thoughts on this as a civil rights attorney, but also someone who has a lot of animal rights sympathies, from my perspective, the fundamental problem here is when living creatures, human or non-human, are treated as commodities for corporations to abuse. We need to recognize the biological, the moral, the political, the common sense truth of the matter, which is that whether it's a dog or a pig or a chicken or a cow, a living creature is not a piece of garbage. And until our legal system shifts and transforms to acknowledge that basic biological and moral fact, these corporations will still get away with horrendous abuses like the abuse I just showed. What do you think about that? What do you think about transforming our legal system in a way that gives animals some basic legal standing?
So that's, in the animal law world, efforts at what it's called animal personhood are really what the end game really is. So, personhood doesn't necessarily mean a human being. In the law, person is an entity that has some kind of legal recognition. So a ship is a person, a corporation is a person, all kinds of, a trust can be a person, all sorts of creations of people can be persons. And so are people who, there's a lot of discussion in the law of, they want rights without responsibilities, and animals can't have responsibilities. That's also just a bogus argument. There are people with severe cognitive impairments. There are infants. There are people with mental health issues who don't have responsibilities in the way that we normally think of them, but they certainly doesn't mean that you can throw them in a crate until their mammary glands give out from overuse. It's just not. That's not how it happens. So there's a lot of efforts being done by great people. The Animal Legal Defense Fund has a really cool case in Oregon right now. The Non-Human Rights Project does good work. PETA is doing some work on this front. So that's the ultimate end goal. But ultimately, what you were talking about cultures that treat people and creatures like machines. Even animal personhood isn't quite going to get us. It might get us where we need to be in the law, but it's not going to get us where we need to be culturally. We have corporations and other people who treat other people as if they are property, or treat other people as if they don't have their own autonomy, their own feelings, their own sentience. So part of the animal rights movement, I think, and is part of the broader struggle of just a greater empathy and a cultural shift of just not mechanizing both people and animals or any sentient being.
Yeah, because I mean, what's happened over the past, especially 10 to 20 years, is two things. One is incredible concentration of power in the hands of a very small number of folks, where Amazon, for example, is now over a $1 trillion company. Jeff Bezos alone controls $130 billion of wealth. But secondly, there's been a mechanization of everything. That there's been a big shift away from labor towards capital. So the investment bankers, the finance folks, the capitalists, and the entrepreneurs of this nation are making huge amounts of money, but ordinary people who used to have like decent middle-class jobs, those jobs are disappearing. They're being turned into machines, and it's a commodification of life, and the consequences, and again, I'm going to show you some very disturbing footage. The consequences are dire for humans and non-human animals, and this is a scene from inside a Smithfield factory farm where these baby pigs have literally been commodified to the point that even as they're drowning in a pile of feces in afterbirth, this mother pig is trapped in a crate where she can't even turn around and help her babies when they're collapsed on the ground sick and drowning in afterbirth and manure and feces. And this is sickening misconduct. But I think ultimately what has to change is we have to wrench back control, not just of our food system, but our political system. We have to recognize that we do have power, that in democracy, if we stand up and speak out, that we can change these systems, we can hold these corporations accountable. And one of the reasons these corporations are so intent on suppressing the truth from coming out is because they know that we have power, that an agitated populace that is informed and outraged about corporate abuses can actually change the world. And so they need to stop us. But what they're finding is in the era of smartphones, technology has cost and has benefits. The cost is it mechanizes everything. It puts power in the hands of a small number of corporations. But it also gives us an enormous amount of power because every person who's got one of these smartphones now has a camera that can change the world. Amy Meyer didn't have some fancy camera when she shot that footage in Utah. I'm pretty sure this is just a smartphone that she pulled out and said, oh my gosh, there is a cow collapsed on the ground, sick and dying, being pulled around on a bulldozer. And I've now got the ability to take footage of that cow being abused, post it on YouTube, and reach potentially 6 or 7 billion people. That's power that people never had before. So for me, what I always tell people is if we actually want some long-term solutions to these problems, we have to find the power within ourselves. And that's where I'll probably end this conversation, which is get out there and find your voice. And if you don't know how to do it, there's a great place to find your voice, which is the Animal Liberation Conference. It's coming up in May. It's a big coalition of grassroots activists from around the world. The Pulitzer Prize winner, Glenn Greenwald, has come in the past. The legendary animal rights activist, the founder of big animal rights organizations, come. And unlike other conferences, this is a conference that is entirely about building your practical skills and knowledge to make you the most effective advocate you can be. And you were there with us last year. And because of some of the advice and training you gave us, and because of all the work we did together, we did something that's never been done before. We walked into a massive factory farm with 500 nonviolent activists, took the place over, and took out 37 animals and got national media in the meantime. So you're a lawyer. You do a lot of your work in courts, but I'm wondering if you can comment a little bit about how important it is from your perspective as a lawyer working in the courts for people to hit the streets as well, to get trained and empowered and ready to fight, not just in the courtroom, but in our own communities.
There's absolutely nothing more important. The courts are a sideshow and a distraction. I came up. The only reason I wanted to be a lawyer is because a lawyer from the National Lawyers Guild got me out of jail at one of my first protest arrests when I was a teenager, and I was like, "That's a cool thing to do." My parents always said I should be a lawyer because I'm kind of an asshole. So I can use that skill to help build movements. There's not really a lot of hope in the law. The law is a conservative institution. There's only about a 15-year period where the Supreme Court was actually a progressive force. All other times in U.S. history, it's been a pretty conservative one. The courts are a pretty conservative force. So we can't put our faith in that. We have to build movements. And what I try to how I learned and how I try to teach younger lawyers is, as movement attorneys, we have to be focused on protecting the people who are out there building movements and being in the streets, and protect the rights of people to be in the streets, and protect the rights of people who are doing the actual work to do the actual work, and not try to tell them paternalistically as lawyers what the best way to do that is, or what the safest way to do that is, but just support the decisions that they make, because they know how to, better than us, how to advance the law.
This is coming from the lawyer who struck down 3 Ag-Gag laws across the nation. He's telling you that at the end of the day, if we're going to make change, it depends on you. That he doesn't have the answers to prevent the industry from controlling our food system, abusing animals, and making our kids sick. So take that call to action and come to UC Berkeley. There's a big coalition of animal rights advocates, environmental activists, and human rights activists who have been gathering together. Glenn Greenwald, the Pulitzer Prize winner, will be there. It's going to be at the end of May at UC Berkeley. Just Google Animal Liberation Conference and come. If I'm not in jail, I'm going to be there. And I just want to end by saying, I'm not switching back. I want to end by saying that, Paul Watson, the legendary environmental animal rights activist, one of the founders of Greenpeace, he's fond of saying that if the oceans die, we all die. Because the oceans are sick. Things like the thermohaline system, that the oceans drive so much air and water and precipitation. People depend on the ocean for food and survival. I want to add to that, it's not just about the ocean, it's about all the animals of this earth. Because of how tightly linked all life on this earth is, if the animals die, we all die. And if we don't get these factory farms under control in the next 10 to 15 years, it might be too late. Because of the pollution, the greenhouse gases they're emitting into the environment, because of the diseases they're spreading, especially in communities of color now. But I got something to tell you. It's not just communities of color that are going to get sick from the MRSA and the antibiotics and the C. diff and the E. coli and the salmonella and factory farms. It's going to spread to your family too, regardless of where you live, because that's the nature of human disease. And it's about the animals in our conscience too, that we cannot live in a good society when we take the most gentle and vulnerable beings on this earth and we absolutely brutalize them. We savagely abuse them and treat them as if they're just things. Because if our society is going to be a good one, we should be tested not by how we treat the powerful, but how we treat the vulnerable. And the most vulnerable creatures on this earth are being placed in metal tombs, are being mutilated and cannibalized by the billions, by powerful corporations that we, though they are powerful, we have the power and the strength to stop them. But only if we hit the streets and take Matthew's call to action to get to the Animal Liberation Conference, raise our voices, fight with every ounce of our energy that we possibly can to make sure that these abuses end and these corporations are held accountable. So any final thoughts for the live stream, Matthew, before we leave?
Here. I'm not going to try to top that.
All right, sounds good. Well, again, I hope to see all of you at the Animal Liberation Conference. If you want to find out more about our case, I'll just show you an article that Glenn Greenwald wrote. Animal rights activists face multiple felony charges brought by prosecutors with ties to Smithfield Foods. Google Glenn Greenwald's reporting on this. This has been in the New York Times, the Washington Post, many other publications. But Glenn Greenwald has probably done the best reporting on this and showing how this is not just an animal rights issue. This is a political issue. This is a political issue that relates to the future existence of human civilization. And we need the entire progressive movement behind animal rights activists fighting for transparency, accountability, and justice in our food system. But beyond just reading more about it, obviously, take action yourself. Find your voice, find some friends, and fight like hell to ensure that these corporations can't continue abusing animals and polluting our air and our water, because it is our air, our water, our nation. At the end of the day, it is our nation. It doesn't belong to Smithfield. It doesn't belong to Amazon and Whole Foods and Jeff Bezos and John Mackey. It belongs to us. But these corporations rely on our ignorance and our passivity to continue to do the terrible things they're doing. But if we inform ourselves and we're not passive, we fight, we shout, we take direct action, then they will be held accountable and the world will become a better place. Okay, well, thanks to all of you, especially the folks from Now This, for listening to this conversation. Thank you so much to Matthew Strugar for joining this conversation. This is incredibly informative to me. Even as a lawyer, I hadn't learned as much as I should have learned about the Ag-Gag cases in North Carolina and Missouri. And I hope you continue to doing the great work you're doing. And I hope everyone on this live stream supports not just Matthew, but the animal rights activists and the animals themselves who are suffering. And I'm going to end with a cute clip of a baby pig who was rescued from a Smithfield farm, because everyone knows that baby pigs
sleepyhead. How are you?
are the cutest animals in
Good
the world.
girl. You want to cook?
And this is a baby pig named Lily who was rescued from a Smithfield farm. And as a result of our investigation and rescue at a Smithfield farm, the FBI crossed 2 state lines, tried to chase this baby back, chase this baby down, and send her back to slaughter, which is a disturbing use of prosecutorial resources, but also just an egregious injustice, because after all of us love baby animals, and no baby animal should be sent to slaughter. Okay, thanks to you, Matthew. Thanks to all of you for joining us. And again, come to the Animal Liberation Conference in May. I'm going to see you there. You're going to make a difference for the animals and for the planet if you come, and you might meet Matthew Strugar. Are you actually coming to the Animal Liberation Conference, Matthew?
Not unclear at the moment, but I hope to.
Okay, awesome. Thanks to all of you for joining. I'll see you all next time. Bye.
Bye, everybody.
All right. I'm ending the live stream.